Hello and welcome back to the Karma Stories podcast. I'm Rob and I hope you are having a wonderful day today. Today I have two HOA stories for you from the ProRevenge subreddit. The Karma Stories podcast is published to all major podcasting platforms, and you can also read along on YouTube under our @Karma Stories podcast handle. If you have a story you'd like to submit to the podcast, you can do so by email at karmastoriespod@gmail.com. If you enjoy true crime stories, make sure to check out our new podcast, Karma Crime, available on all major podcasting platforms. We have 3 episodes up there already and a new one coming out tomorrow morning. I'd love it if you could go check them out and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast platform of choice. Alright, on to today's HOA revenge stories. Let's jump right in. This story comes to us from BB Keys, the HOA president's long goodbye. Posting on behalf of a friend who isn't on Reddit, this is for you, Jake. When I moved into my suburban neighborhood, I expected peace and quiet. Instead, I walked into a petty dictatorship run by our HOA president, Todd. Todd was the worst kind of leader, the kind who loved power but hated accountability. He enforced ridiculous rules, like fining people $200 for leaving their trash cans out a minute past 9 a.m., but blatantly ignored the rules when it suited him. His own yard was a mess of unpermitted structures, and his fence was taller than allowed by city ordinances. But Todd's true sin? Using the HOA as his personal piggy bank. At first, I tried reasoning with him. My fence was slightly off color because the approved stain wasn't available, and he fined me $500. I explained, provided receipts, and asked for leniency. Todd smirked and said, "Rules are rules," and walked away. That's when I decided I would take him down. Not with screaming or public arguments, but methodically, legally, and in a way he'd never recover from. Step 1. Become the inside man. Todd's first mistake was underestimating me. I volunteered for the HOA board under the guise of wanting to get involved in the community. I played the part of the eager, naive newbie perfectly. For 2 years, I attended every meeting, quietly observing how Todd operated. I learned he controlled the board by bullying other members and burying them in paperwork. He'd push through votes only his allies were present and conveniently lose paperwork submitted by dissenting homeowners. I kept my head down, took detailed notes, and waited. My goal was to outlast his term as president so I could begin making changes. Then I discovered Todd's second mistake. He wasn't just a bully, he was a thief. Step 2. Follow the money. Todd loved to brag about how he kept the HOA's finances in order, but something didn't add up. The annual HOA fees were high, much higher than in similar neighborhoods, but the common areas were falling apart. The pool was closed half the summer due to maintenance issues, and the landscaping looked like it hadn't been touched in months. I started digging. As the HOA treasurer, Todd had access to all the accounts, but he was notoriously cagey about sharing financial details. I asked for the budget during a meeting, and Todd laughed it off, saying, "Don't worry, I've got it under control." I filed a formal request for the financial records, which under HOA rules, he was required to provide. Weeks went by with no response. That's when I started talking to neighbors. Turns out I wasn't the only one suspicious. Over a dozen homeowners had requested access to the budget over the years, only to be ignored. One neighbor claimed Todd had used HOA funds to install a new patio at his house, while another swore he'd seen Todd's kids at the community pool during its maintenance closure. Armed with these suspicions, I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, forcing Todd to provide the records. He stalled, but I wasn't backing down. Step 3. Build the case. When Todd finally handed over the financial documents, they were a mess. Invoices were missing, payments were mislabeled, and some expenses were downright bizarre. A $15,000 landscaping fee paid to a company that didn't exist. Thousands spent on administrative costs with no explanation. I cross-referenced the HOA's bank statements with public records and found the smoking gun. Todd was funneling money to his personal accounts. Even better, I discovered Todd had been inflating contractor fees, pocketing the difference and splitting the profits with his buddy, a shady contractor who handled most of the HOA's maintenance. I compiled everything into a detailed report, complete with spreadsheets, photos, and notarized statements from neighbors who had seen Todd's antics firsthand. Step 4. The coup. I waited for the annual HOA meeting, which was typically a snooze fest attended by only a handful of homeowners. But this time, I made sure people showed up. I spent weeks knocking on doors, explaining what Todd had been up to. I didn't share everything, just enough to get people angry and curious. On the night of the meeting, the room was packed. Todd started the meeting like usual, droning on about how difficult it was to manage the HOA and how much he'd sacrificed for the community. That's when I stood up. I calmly asked if he could explain some discrepancies in the budget. Todd laughed nervously and said, "I don't think this is the time or place." I replied, "Actually, Todd, it's the perfect time." I handed out copies of my report to everyone in the room. The mood shifted instantly. People started reading, whispering, and then shouting. Todd tried to regain control, but it was too late. I called for a vote to remove him as president. By the end of the night, Todd was out. Step 5. The final blow. After Todd was removed, we hired an independent auditor to go through the HOA's finances. They confirmed everything. Todd had embezzled over $50,000, mismanaged tens of thousands more, and committed multiple accounts of fraud. We reported him to the police and filed a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen funds. But it didn't end there. Todd's shady contractor buddy was also exposed and banned from doing business in the county. Todd had to sell his house to pay restitution and legal fees. His name became a running joke in the neighborhood, and no one would touch him professionally. With Todd gone, we restructured the HOA to prevent another dictator from taking over. We implemented term limits, required multiple board members to approve financial decisions, and created an online portal so all homeowners could access budgets and meeting minutes. The aftermath. Every time I walk past Todd's old house, now owned by a lovely family, I smile. The pool is open, the landscaping is beautiful, and the HOA fees are lower than ever. Todd, meanwhile, moved to a neighboring town where he reportedly tried to join another HOA board, only to be laughed out of the room when someone Googled his name. Justice wasn't just served, it was plated, garnished, and savored. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, we have one from a user called I'm So White and Nerdy. It says, how did Todd end up avoiding prison? The fact that he was free to move to another community and tried to join another HOA board just screams of injustice. Another commenter down below called Samson at Reddit said, I really hope this is true. Honestly, as someone who ran a co-op board managing 350 units, nothing was more exhausting for me than board members who did selfish things. Not theft, but completely self-serving decisions. It was so exhausting. I sold my unit and left. So I want to believe someone got this sort of revenge. I want to say we're not all bad on the board. I tried my best to make good decisions out of hard choices. Do you fix the not to code elevators or fix the roofs? Eventually, what happens is the best people to run such a large complex become exhausted and quit, like I did and several friends. And then the lunatics have full reign. Crazy and or selfish people wear you out. OP did mention in another comment that Jake, the person they posted this story for, is a lawyer, and so that definitely helped them in getting everything together that they needed to get this guy out of being the HOA president. One thing I'm not understanding here is, should there not be term limits for all HOA members, especially the ones up at the top? That would help prevent dictatorship situations like the one that OP had here. I don't know though. Why don't you guys comment down below on YouTube and let me know your thoughts on that one. This story comes to us from Doggo Lago Poo. Oh my. Become the worst neighbor and HOA board member ever. Lose your job and HOA. Let me start by saying, never purchase a house in an HOA. It is a complete mess that should be regulated and illegal. If I knew about HOAs when I bought my first home, I would have never purchased my first home in one. Me and my wife purchased our first home when we were 24 and 25. We spent months looking at houses and areas and tried to find a forever home in a good district for potential future kids, etc. We finally found a perfect one at a decent price. At first, everything was great, super nice neighborhood and decent neighbors. Well, a few months after buying the house, we rented an RV to go on a trip and parked it in the driveway for the 3 days leading up to the trip to pack it and for me to learn how half the things worked in it. Well, this is when we learned that HOAs are absolutely crazy, and our neighbor was on the board of our local HOA. Within an hour of it being parked, he got home and stormed over, demanding we remove it from his neighborhood, or he would have it towed and fine us for every hour it was there. Myself, being the average and normal person, told him to kindly F off and get out of my driveway, and told him if he returns, I'll call the cops, because he was screaming like a madman inches from my face. About 3 hours later, a big rig tow truck shows up, and he walked up like he was a god and handed me a plain envelope with a letter inside that pretty much said, by order of the HOA, this RV is to be towed, and a fine of $1,500 for violating their rules. While Mr. Crazy board member might not listen to reason, the tow truck guy they found wasn't so fond of entering my driveway and towing my vehicle when I told him if he comes on the property, I'll call the cops. Once the tow truck driver decided he's done being involved in this mess and left, neighbor goes even more crazy and storms off. I call my friend to get his dad's number because he's an attorney to ask him about this insane letter and fine I just received and to ask him some legal advice. After speaking to his father, he told me to come down, write him a $500 check, and bring along all the papers I received when purchasing the home and the current letter I just received. The next day, he had a very friendly letter sent to my neighbor and the HOA board, basically telling my neighbor to F himself in legal terms and to leave us and our property alone. I then continued to receive fines of $1,500 a day in plain envelopes, not postmarked but stuffed into my mailbox, that I then turned over to my friend's father, and each time he set another set of letters and contacted USPS to report the incidents. Turns out putting mail into people's mailbox is a crime. Who knew? Well, we decided to go on our week-long trip across the state and mildly forget about it all. Kind of upset I had to spend $500 to have an attorney send letters, but that's what they do. Fast forward to us returning from the trip and the RV back in our driveway for 2 days so we can unload and clean and then return it. Again, each day more envelopes stuffed into our mailbox and more visits to our attorney and more letters sent and more incidents reported to USPS. Well, here's where the fun really begins. Turns out Mr. Crazy finally gives me a summons to appear before the board. My attorney said this is crazy illegal because what they've done is use what looks like an actual legal document improperly to summon me to the board. Another $500 to the attorney, and we wait for the date they made, a Tuesday at 10 a.m. They attempt to keep my attorney out of the room on some board privacy rule, but quickly shut the heck up when he begins going over their own rules that they are violating to them. Deep in this HOA book are some very nicely worded rules and stuff outlining about what makes board members ineligible and how they cannot serve if they commit certain infractions. Well, guess what Mr. Crazy Neighbor has done? Committed several of them, all documented. Also, the cherry on top is that if 51% of the HOA members vote to dissolve the HOA, it all goes away. Well, it happens my wife worked part-time from home during this mess and had all the free time in the world to begin a disband the HOA campaign. Over the course of the next 2 months, she went around and really began to get to know our neighborhood really well. Turns out a lot of people dislike the HOA and the power-hungry seniors who act like dictators that run it. The HOA attempted to stall everything by holding no meetings, another HOA violation, and began their own campaign trying to change HOA rules to keep from being ousted, and a fairly racist flyer and letter to everyone explaining the dangers of not having an HOA and all the bad people that will move in and take over and sell substances, etc. That our houses would become much less valuable and everything else they could try. Turns out it's extremely fun to use someone's own rules against them. The neighborhood even started a fund that paid us back what it cost us to get the attorney started and the continued cost he had. A few weeks after their failed fear campaign and being forced to hold a meeting, a vote was called by using their own rules. The HOA was no more, and all remaining funds were to be dispersed back to the homeowners and members equally. This never happened. Turns out somehow the HOA used all their funds in the course of the last 2 months. About half the former board members sold their homes and moved, including Mr. Crazy Neighbor. I've spent 3 hours trying to find old news articles because it was reported on mostly due to the racist letters by the HOA, but it was too long ago to find anything. Moral of the whole mess, don't buy a home in an HOA, and if you do, plan to hire an attorney. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, we have one from a user called F Cave Troll. It says, should have investigated the disappeared funds. They probably didn't have any receipts to prove that they used the money for the intended purpose of repairs, etc. Another commenter called Bob D785 said, I've heard lots of horror stories about HOAs, and I'm glad yours got disbanded. I'm sure they'll have their place if they're run by reasonable people, but that seems to be few and far between. OP responded to this one and said, I've never met anyone that's been happy in an HOA. My friends live in one that had a neighborhood pool for members. When it was proposed, it seemed great. Unfortunately, it now costs nearly quadruple what they estimated and sold to the members. Their fees skyrocketed, and members decided they didn't feel like funding the pool anymore. So tens of thousands of dollars later, it sits empty and cannot be sold. Turns out some HOA rules prohibit them from selling any HOA property. Does it seem to anyone else that with all these HOA stories we hear, a common denominator in them is that it's the old geezer people on the HOA board who have the problems with the younger people in the HOA? It's like they just have to have something to hold on to in their old age, something to keep them busy. Like, come on, get off my lawn. One thing I can say with absolute certainty is I'm pretty happy to be living up here in Canada because HOAs really aren't a thing up here. That seems to be something that's really prevalent in the USA, but not so much anywhere else. If you enjoy daily Reddit stories, I encourage you to follow and add us to your favorites on whichever podcasting platform you enjoy the most. And if you're watching and listening on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button and drop a like on the video. It really helps us out. If you enjoyed true crime stories, make sure to check out our new podcast, Karma Crime, available on all major podcasting platforms. I thank you for watching and listening. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.